Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, the newest podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody, one of the co-hosts here.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
And today we are going over Chapter 5 of The Crying of Lot 49. We are one chapter away from being done with this. This was a longer chapter, and there is quite a lot to go over in this, so I'll turn it over to Will for a summary of the chapter.
Yeah. Oedipa, in pursuit of the trail of Tristero and intrigued by Kotek's obsession with the Nefastis machine, heads to Berkeley and checks into a hotel near midnight that's hosting the California chapter of the American Deaf Mute Assembly. Exhausted, she struggles to collapse into sleep in a room decorated with a mirror and a Remedios Varo print. In her best attempt, she dreams of her and Mucho having beach sex, but wakes up to her own mirror image glaring back at her, upright. She visits the publisher of the original edition of Jacobean Revenge Plays, who sell her a copy and direct her to the warehouse in Oakland to pick it up. When she finally can, she turns to the page that her used copy indicated would hold the variants of the Tristero line, but finds only an outline of 3 other versions and their sources, and names Tristero as only part of a nonsense pun. The editor was a Professor Emery Bortz, who'd been employed by UC Berkeley at the time of writing, but when Oedipa reaches the English department of the campus, she's told he'd moved to San Narciso College. Oedipa takes this as predictable. As she wanders through the teeming university, Oedipa is struck by the social and political currents swirling about the commons. She wonders at such a steep generational divide and takes solace that her lack of coordination in the counterculture is made up for by her adeptness at navigating historical mysteries. After finding Nefastis' address in a phone book, she makes her way to his apartment. She introduces herself, referring to Kotek's, and asks about being tested for sensitivity to Maxwell's demon. He half apologizes for his viewership of a children's dance performance on the tube, and Oedipa absolves his guilt by explaining her own familiarity with the pedophilic. Nefastis seems appreciative. The machine is identical to the patent and is presented alongside an information dump about entropy, faith in the demon, and communication. When she asks about a coincidence, Nefastis describes the demon as having been real to Maxwell long before the days of the metaphor. Slightly offended by the profile's refusal to meet her gaze, Oedipa spends at least the better part of an hour, closer to 2, begging the demon to make an overture while Hanna-Barbera cartoons roll by Nefastis' focus. Through force of sheer will, she beholds a maybe shift of the piston, but cannot believe. Oedipa decides the inventor is delusional, and that any sensitive must simply be open to his influence, not the demon. Regardless, she endeavors for another quarter of an hour. Brought nearly to tears by the effort, Nefastis soothes her as best he knows, proposing a quickie in front of the newsreel soon to air on screen, himself anticipating some Orientalist eroticism to bleed through. Oedipa declines with the scream and flee maneuver. He asks her to pass along greetings to Kotek as she starts driving away. Automatically joining the throngs on the freeway, Oedipa contemplates the apparent spread of LA-type traffic patterns and haze, even as far north as San Francisco. The death-defying weaving vehicles provide sufficient background noise to accommodate the consolidation of a few threads of inquiry. At the bottom of this recontextualization, she holds her few facts in one hand, the potential of incoherence in the other, and decides to drift among the masses of the more northern city, so to sift a population less entangled with Pierce for evidence either way. She parks on a side street and embarks on the mission. Rather shortly, she finds herself pushed into the numbers of a tour of the gayer establishments that help make the local culture so rich, and in such a bar encounters the lapel pin of the muted post horn. The bearer seems unsettled by Oedipa's curiosity and tries deflecting her first few questions, until she vomits a spew of her theories and concerns surrounding the symbol. Disheartened by such an effusive display of sincerity, the man with the pin explains his perspective. As far as he knows, the symbol is the trademark of an underground society, the Innamorati Anonymous, of people who've sworn off love to provide support on demand to other members, perfect strangers about to relapse into their terrible addiction. The organization had been founded by a man left by his wife following his career's deprecation via computer automation, who sought out public opinion on the viability of suicide. He received a load of correspondence from a hook-handed bum one Sunday evening, nearly all addressed from those who'd failed their own attempts. None made a strong case for life, but he waited for inspiration regardless. It arrived with the self-immolation of the Buddhist monk. After dousing himself with gasoline in the kitchen, his ex and the man responsible for his unemployment barge in and begin fooling around in the next room before noticing the smell and the executive's hysterical laughs. They only mocked his ambivalence. He laughed even more until they leave, and found some stamps bleached by the gas in his pocket. All that remained on their faces was the watermark of the muted horn. Spitefully, he swore off love and took the image for his own. Drunkenly, the innamorato wanders off post-narrative, and Oedipa resumes her downward spiral. Suddenly confronted by her local relative's sexlessness, she abandons the tour and begins her drifting again. Soon, and following throughout the rest of the night, she happens upon one after another indication of sanity. A children's game, like hopscotch, played by the astral projection of dreaming kids who only know the rough rhymes of her own keywords. Gang members sporting such symbols on their coats. The shape underlined with the acrostic, "Don't ever antagonize the horn." It on a bulletin board, assuring those curious they already knew how to find out more. A girl on the bus tracing it in her breath's window fog. A mother impressing upon her son not to trust the government post, only W.A.S.T.E. She comes across an acquaintance she'd met in Mexico with Pierce, an anarchist with the Confederación de los Insurgentes Anarquistas, named Jesus Arrabal. He'd been spooked by inferiorities in humanity, his epitomization of the elite villain, and named him an anarchist miracle, like a virgin appearing to an Indian. Such insight had disturbed Oedipa, inspired senseless jealousy. They part, and Oedipa feels that the dead billionaire had been their coordinating principle. Some very out-of-date syndicalist papers had arrived from a waste carrier, and Jesus expresses his faith in the higher levels. As she wanders, an association is secured. Wherever there's an instance of embraced disenfranchisement, there too will be the horn, in some form or another. In retrospect, Oedipa cannot later be too certain of the actual prevalence of such a pattern, but such is the paranoia. It has taken her naive curiosity and replaced the noir with absurd, boundless optimism with shaky cynicism. Outsiders of all sorts were retreating from the mechanics of public life, silent, frightened privacy. But Jesus and the innamorato are not the final brushes of personal connection she'd feel that night. Exhausted and disheveled, she finds an old sailor, blurred post-horn inked on his hand, and promises to deposit his ancient letter to a wife abandoned into a waste box. Holding his fragile body, Oedipus shares in his grief, cradles him like a lost child. When his friend appears and helps guide them to the sailor's home, Oedipa can't help but foster her own mourning for her inability to truly save him. He waves her off, and when she hands over a $10 note, he's upset she wouldn't wait for the friend to leave, for discretion. Following his directions to the drop box, the entropy analogy finally connects for Oedipa. She sees clearly how the sailor's delirium tremens coincide with the infinitesimal slices of a curve that underlie calculus, flashes of hyper-reality as severe as her own, but only a progression towards utter mental collapse. She finds it, the waste box, just a public trash can under an overpass, inscribed with the name and subtle periods alone revealing its true nature. She waits in the shadows for another depositor, then adds the sailor's mail to the pile. Around noon, a young courier collects the contents, and Oedipa sets off in pursuit. She follows him to a rendezvous with a fellow carrier, but continues tailing her original postman for hours. They take a train to Oakland, and Oedipa is dragged for hours through neighborhoods unknown. Incredibly, his final destination is the same apartment building that John Nefastis inhabits. Somehow returning to her hotel, she's coerced away from the call of her bed and into joining the deaf-mute conference party and dancing. Surrounded by what should have been Brownian motion, Oedipa recognizes her own beholding of an anarchist miracle as the masses of dancers' sans accompaniment proceed without collision. Finally, sleep. Unable to cope with the density of her night, she returns to Kinneret and seeks her psychiatrist for any sort of assurance. Unfortunately, Hilarius is taking pot shots at her as she pulls up. Dodging bullets, when she makes it inside, the assistant Helga Blam explains that the good doctor is convinced he's under assault by some outside force. Blam blames his endless stream of bananas clients. Figuring her recent absence may inspire trust somehow, Oedipa knocks on the office door and Hilarius starts babbling, expressing remorse for some unspoken past ill acts. He confesses to experimentation in Buchenwald, explains his facial therapy methods developed from one such visage which banished a young Jew named Zvi to hopeless insanity. He threatens to unleash this expression upon his assailants and asks her to pass this message along. When the cops break down the front door, he pulls her inside and reveals that he didn't know who he'd been talking to except for the nebulous other. Through the door, a police officer takes her life story to paper for the news media. Hilarius continues to unload his baggage. He devoted his post-SS life to the study of Freud, trying his best to reverse his anti-Semitic karma, but knowing he'd end up like Eichmann on trial in Israel. Simply stated, his window for penitence was closed. In his grief, he's left the Gewehr on his desk, so Oedipa retrieves it, says, "I ought to kill you." But when she lets him live, Hilarius is struck with tears. He asks why she'd come if not for that, and impresses upon her to hold on to her fantasies, so not to dissolve her individuality. She lets the cops in and finds Mucho in the KCUF mobile reporting unit outside. They record an ultra-brief interview about this terrible thing, and cut the broadcast. Oedipa follows the van to the studio and is met by Mucho's boss, who seems to feel that Mr. Moss is suffering from some illness, a plurality of his spirit, a genericization of himself. The happy couple drive to grab some lunch, and Mucho is preternaturally sure of the lack of romance between Oedipa and Metzger. He begins pontificating on some subjective experience of infinite precision spectral analysis, loving the humanity of a mistuned violin string. That a repeated phrase is somehow spoken always in the same voice, regardless of the speaker. Disturbed by a sudden genuine belief in "she loves me," Oedipa confronts him for an explanation of his personality shift. It turns out that one of Hilarius's final acts of semi-sanity was to expand Die Brücke to male clients, and Mucho was on acid. Scared, Oedipa believes that she'd seen the last of her husband the day she rented the Impala. He offers to share his newfound peace of mind, but she only shakes no before leaving to return to San Narciso. She realizes she couldn't have asked about the stamp. That kiss goodbye may have been their final.
So, quite a lot going on in this chapter. I just want to start off by kind of getting everybody's overall opinion on this chapter as it relates to the rest of the book.
I think that if the last chapter, as I talked about last week, sort of represents a point of conversion for Oedipa, then it's likely that this chapter is sort of her first steps into being not only fully sold into the Tristero and the conspiracy surrounding the waste post system, but also her understanding that this is something that is truly going to probably take over the rest of her life. You know, looking at this chapter in how constantly Pynchon goes back to these motifs of her being convinced that she's not crazy as she's going through all of the streets at night. She keeps seeing the system everywhere. She keeps seeing it tattooed on people. She's seeing it, as graffiti on walls. She's seeing it on clothing, that lapel pin when she's in the bar. And constantly, it seems as though she is a bit at war with herself in that she wants to believe that she's crazy in some respect because it will make this whole thing easier, but she's being reminded that she is not, and that she's fully come through this with a proper understanding that there is a vaster conspiracy at work here. There's a vaster network. There's a line in particular where she kind of realizes that this seems to be the system of communication that almost every single underground group uses with one another. And so it is her being fully convinced, but also wanting to make sure that that is the case, and also yearning somewhat for the simpler life that she had prior in ignorance.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is, I think, really for me. I would even say personally, this is probably my favorite chapter in the book. And yeah, Oedipa at this point, it's pretty cemented that she's in this thing, and there's no going back at this point. I don't really think I could add anything to your description of it, Kate. I thought that was perfect. That's exactly how I felt, coming away from it. Um, it's again, going back to last week when we kind of talked about how sad it is to see Oedipa stuck in this situation, and that really gets hammered home even more here for me. Just and as you described it, where she's fully aware of how enveloped she is in this, and that there really almost is no way out, and that this is becoming her life now, and this is the only real thing that she has, as sad as it is, that can keep her going, knowing the consequence it's going to have on her.
Yeah, and I can talk more about it when we get to talk about Nefastis in that particular scene, but there does seem to be a prevailing sentiment through most of the chapter that she realizes that this is just another method of entrapment for her, that there is no escaping through understanding what this is or where it comes from or what it means like she had hoped there would be, which, to your point, really redoubles just how tragic of a character she is.
One thing that struck me about this chapter is how much it's depicted that Oedipa is not in control over her own life. I think there's maybe 3 different times that she's swept along by a crowd, non-consensually. It does seem to be like she doesn't seem to be in control of herself, even whenever she's wandering San Francisco looking for signs. It's not necessarily a logical thing to do. She seems a little bit overly consumed by her search. I did find it interesting. I mean, I do feel like she did kind of start taking control of her life and her surroundings during the showdown with Hilarius, where she grabs his gun and I think she points it at him, and is finally kind of, instead of letting other people kind of make her decisions for her and do it like, she seems to instead be the one whose actions are what are dominating the surrounding that she's in. I just found that interesting to think about. I mean, I've talked about this a little bit in past episodes, but Oedipa doesn't have a lot of agency, a lot of control over her surroundings, which you could interpret that as being, I think nowadays people really love it when women in literature have a little bit more control and agency. But when you think about, he was writing this at the same time as Gravity's Rainbow, and a lot of characters in Gravity's Rainbow are kind of similar to Oedipa in this chapter, in that they're just kind of being swept along by their surroundings. Like, Slothrop does not have barely any control over his life. I just find it interesting to think about how it's it's over and over shown that Oedipa is not doing the best job of taking control of what she's doing.
Yeah, and to your point about her taking control over the situation with Hilarius, she also takes control over the situation with her marriage at the end of the chapter. She goes from diffusing this one situation that she's driven herself into and is now solving through her own actions, to, in that sort of final conversation between her and Mucho, he mentally seems to decide this is the end of the relationship. Like, there's no reason for me to be in this marriage any longer. I'll kiss this man one last time, talk to him one last time, and then that'll be the end of it. So you are correct in that while she has moved from being trapped in one position to now being more mentally trapped in another with the muted post-Horn conspiracy, she is actively learning how to wrest more control for herself on the environment that does surround her, that she does have some say in.
Yeah, in some general sense, the whole chapter is her exercising almost a Taoist impulse to surrender to the flow around her, while constantly fighting against it and trying to force everything into relevant and irrelevant piles. And that conflict seems to teach her that, yeah, at some point you do need to put your foot down. You do need to decide one way or the other. You can't just let things keep on moving you without your say-so.
And I like the fact that Will brought up this was being written around the same time that Gravity's Rainbow was, because there are, as we've mentioned in I think it was in the chapter 3 episode with the casino that seemed, very similar to the Casino Hermangerg. There's a lot of bits here and there, and we'll get into them more, where there's these kind of connections to things that happen in Gravity's Rainbow, not necessarily plot points, although those are there, I think, but also characters, concepts, little things that get peppered in here and there, and it kind of made me think more and more about how the writing process of this was, in a way, I guess, a lead up to what he was going to do with Gravity's Rainbow, and how it, yeah, we talked about his quote unquote dislike of this book, and I can't help but wonder if that's because he was using this to fill that time between V and Gravity's Rainbow, and this was just kind of a sounding board to get some of those ideas out there in a much more epic scale that would come in Gravity's Rainbow. But let's talk about characters, because we get a few new ones here. I don't think it was as many as chapter 4, but there were still quite a few. So first off, there's Emery Bortz. I absolutely love that name. And my kind of knee-jerk reaction to that name and that character was wondering if he has that name specifically because of his being an editor for that collection of plays that was mysteriously missing any mention of Trastero, that he's perhaps, as his name implies, filing down the parts, that the imperfections or the sharp edges that would be needed to be removed from there. I don't know if y'all have a similar idea on that, or
It certainly makes sense for the character. Like I wouldn't be surprised if that was why Pynchon named him that at all. He's very big into using names to describe what a character does or is or represents.
Yeah, and often in a very indirect way, maybe not indirect, but maybe obtuse would be the better word, where it's there and it's always right there, but sometimes you have to kind of dig to get the true kind of meaning of it. We also meet Nefastis for the first time, who I immediately dislike every time, just because he's an absolute fucking creep.
Wonder why you might dislike that guy.
Yeah.
Right? I know. It's one of those things I feel like I block it from my memory every time I go back to this, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I hate this guy. And there's nothing, no good qualities about him. He's an absolute asshole and a creep.
Another instance of the name matching literally what he is.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We have the unnamed person at the Greek Way that Oedipus spends a pretty good chunk of time talking to, and I think was a vital character to the chapter and the story in general. What were y'all's thoughts on him?
I do wonder how seriously we're supposed to take Nefastis. I mean, he does have Oedipa stare at a picture for seemingly over an hour. And while I do feel like his joke, I mean, I guess he really isn't joking about having sex while watching the news. But that does, I mean, I don't know. I think if I was alive in the 60s, I might have found that funny, especially the part about China. Because it does make sense logically why that would, I mean, it's a really weird thing to write or to say. But I mean, one thing you do think about when you think about China, especially after World War II, is just how big the population is. So I don't know. It does scan to me as like an attempt at humor. I don't necessarily know if Nefastis is joking or not. I kind of lean towards he's not, and he's actually, a creep and a pervert. But it can be viewed as comedic or funny, I would say.
Yeah, the difficult part for me when it comes to viewing it through that lens, because absolutely, I mean, you can view all horrible things as absurd in some way. It's just that Pynchon has nailed the tone that those kinds of cult leader types around the earlier 20th century, like Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons, and L. Ron Hubbard, all kind of shared. And he nails that vibe so much, and that kind of the humor to me comes more across as a villain hiding his true feelings in a lot of ways.
The only reason why I don't scan much of it as humorous, because obviously there is an inherent absurdity to it, but I think the reason I primarily don't scan it as being for humor or humorous is because it is part of an established pattern of Oedipa having run-ins with men and immediately having them be abusive. The only difference really is that Nefastis has no pretense for his request for them to sleep together. Like he doesn't try to ply her with alcohol in the way that some characters do. He doesn't try to necessarily do anything to make it easier to get her to agree to sleep with him. He just walks out of the other room and says, "Yeah, we can do it in here now."
No subtlety whatsoever.
No. And so as sort of being, especially within the context of the chapter of Oedipa moving to taking more control of her circumstances, where instead of kind of playing into the game a bit like she does when she puts on, 36 layers of clothing and while still resisting the impulses of the other man, she just leaves and chooses to remove herself from that situation. So in some ways, I think Nefastis's particular style of abuse in that scene has more to do with the final end conclusion of her continually running into these men who are trying to take advantage of her, where there is no sugarcoating to it. There's no way that you can try and say that it was like a seduction tactic or anything like that. It just is plainly what it is, and both Oedipa and the reader end up with that understanding at the end of the scene.
Yeah. What were y'all's thoughts on the unnamed guy at the Greek Way? The one that Oedipa has a lengthy conversation with?
On some level, I find it very hard to view the Innamorato as much of a character. He absolutely is one, obviously, both literally and, in a spiritual sense. But also, all he really does is say, "Wow, you sure are screwed, aren't you? Well, here's this story I heard." So I just don't find him very compelling as a result.
One thing I found interesting about him is that I think at the beginning of the conversation, Oedipa but just acts like she's from the Thurn and Taxis people, and he doesn't have any idea who that is, which did kind of inform me that you can be a part of the Tristero and a part of W.A.S.T.E. and not know. Like, he only seems to know about the Innamorato Anonymous. He doesn't seem to know about other aspects of the Tristero system, which does seem to speak to a certain amount of, like the different parts of the Tristero are not necessarily aware of the other parts, which I find interesting to think about. I don't know if that ignorance is intentional or not, but he does seem somewhat ignorant of the greater system that he's a part of.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I thought was really interesting about him, is that I read that as kind of showing how vast W.A.S.T.E had become, and Tristero and all of it had become, to the point that that even the people within it have no idea how expansive it really is. That there can be these kind of subsects within the same organization that are completely unaware of the other ones that exist out there.
I think it also shows the way that things can get co-opted and twisted around, which gets back to what we were talking about last week in relation to sort of the counterculture movement that fell apart and was ultimately unsuccessful. That even when you do have something that is this expansive underground network, the symbols are still there that technically anybody can see, and they can get co-opted and turned into something else.
Yeah, and in particular the IA in general, the way it was discussed as complete isolates who respond to calls to help one another. It's modeled as similar to AA or NA, but in reality, what that rings as more akin to just prior to the 60s is the KKK of that time. And it in some way can be viewed as a discussion of how for any meaningful subversive conspiracy to function, you need information siloing, and you need to prevent people from understanding what the left hand is doing if they're operating the right, in order to prevent one person giving up the ghost from ruining the whole cabal. But what it also does is it leads to things like the IA springing up, which are just entirely, essentially pointless, because they're not going to effectively help one another stay not in love. I mean, it's just not an effective mission, is it? What does it achieve?
Yeah, and to kind of build on what you were saying with the information secrecy and stuff, that does kind of remind me of intelligence services, perhaps how the militaries can be run, is information secrecy. I did do a kind of deeper dive on Operation Paperclip and MK Ultra and the kind of confluence between the two, and that is something that came up some, is how members of that conspiracy were not necessarily aware of stuff that was going on elsewhere. And this is kind of a general comment about the Trastero, but this is something that the Michael S. Judge in Death is Just Around the Corner gets into, is you can, if you, this is maybe best viewed through the lens of stuff like WikiLeaks, but you can reduce the CIA down into, people passing messages back and forth. That's what a lot of government is. That's what a lot of intelligence services is. That's what a lot of the military is just people passing messages back and forth, which is an interesting way to view the Trastero as like maybe a replacement of like, the counterculture's intelligence service or something.
Which does get to Oedipa's point that she's, as Pynchon puts into the chapter, it seems like W.A.S.T.E is used by every single underground subversive group for their communication.
Mm-hmm.
Even the dolphins.
The other thing is just an aside on that scene with the unnamed character is I found the monologue where he goes into the history of how the IA was founded. I do think that whole thing is very absurdly funny in the way that it's written, but as somebody who reads a lot of David Foster Wallace's work, it's almost Wallacean in nature. The idea that you have this one problem that continually stacks itself over and over and over and over again until it reaches such an absurd point where this man is going to burn himself in his kitchen in a Buddhist style, and then the reason why he's going to burn himself enters his house and explains that he is even doing that inefficiently, and this is why he was fired. Wallace was obviously a pretty big fan of Pynchon, but sort of spurned the postmodern movement later in his career. It's interesting to see how something like that became so influential in his writing, even after he had moved past wanting to use postmodernism in his own writing.
Well, something else I thought was interesting about that unnamed character was his mention in tying into the whole, trying to help people who need to be in love. He mentioned specifically that you never see those people twice. And I thought that was really, in comparing that to the signs that Oedipa sees later on and has been seeing, they're never seen twice. She sees them when she wants to see them, and then when she goes back to confirm their existence, it's gone, or it's something else. It's one of those tricks of the mind where a shadow in your room is really just a pile of clothes that the light just happened to hit right at that time. As far as other characters, we also had Jesus Arrabal, who I kind of took his whole scene with Oedipa as a sort of literal come to Jesus moment. I don't know what you all thought.
Well, so first of all, we should give him the title he deserves. He's the original Jesus of Suburbia.
This is yes. Yeah. I thought exactly the same thing. I was actually listening to that album not too terribly long ago.
Yeah, but I don't know. I feel like Arabal is he seems to me like just kind of an instance of true believers who contradict themselves once again. Like I mean, at this point, I buy that the CIA is the CIA. It's not actually a separate insurgency group.
One thing I found interesting about his version of the CIA versus the actual CIA, if they are indeed different, is that they both want revolutions to happen, particularly in Latin American countries and South American countries. But the reasons they have for wanting those revolutions to happen are pretty much opposites, which does kind of play into how he views Pierce. I struggled with Oedipa's jealousy and exactly what was going on between Jesus and Pierce. But it does. What I pulled away from it is Pierce seems to be like in some ways the exact opposite of Jesus and what he stands for.
Oh yeah.
Which did kind of, maybe that gives Jesus something to push, because it did seem to initially kind of stun Jesus, but then it seemed to kind of motivate him to stay on his path. And I did think it was interesting that perhaps, Pierce gives him an ideal villain, an ideal opponent, like something to push back on.
I find very interesting in the Jesus section the specific choice of line that he was part owner here with the Yucateco who still believed in the revolution, their revolution. And it's the first word of a sentence, so of course it's going to be capitalized. But so then why is it emphasized as well as capitalized if it's not supposed to be an indication that it's them rather than a genuine grassroots campaign of anarcho-syndicalism?
Yeah, I collect that too, where it definitely does purposely seem to be a capital T they situation, which, I mean, there have been a number of coups that have been put in place in South America in particular to put down popular elections for socialist or other forms of government that were put in place. So it could be a reference to something like that going on.
Well, so the Mexican Revolution actually is kind of a very multi-stage event, and it started out with a U.S. supported placement of President Madero, and the anarcho-syndicalists led by like Pancho Villa and all were a lot of the fighters on the ground floor for the true revolution that wasn't just essentially the CIA's actions. And in this case, it seems like Pynchon might be hinting that even that was seeded.
So the other characters that I don't think I missed any others, but there's also, so we meet Dr. Hilarius for the first time. Really, I guess the only time. How did y'all feel about his role in the chapter?
One thing that occurred to me about that whole section is, I don't know, I didn't want to take it for granted that what he's saying is true and that he was actually involved in all the human experimentation at Camp Buchenwald. I don't know how to say it in German. Because he does seem to know a fair amount about it. Again, I'm not 100% sure on what was public knowledge in the 60s and what was not. And, if Pynchon perhaps had access to classified documents and stuff like that. But the fact that he's being so crazy, the fact that he's being anti-Semitic, which there can be a link between mental health issues and anti-Semitism, I think. I don't know. I kind of, the fact that he has the German rifle does seem to speak to the fact that he maybe was actually part of the SS or whatever the German Nazi people who were running that stuff. But it did occur to me that I could see it being possible that he's just has read about that stuff and he's having a psychotic break and he's just like convinced that he was there, but he actually was not. Because a big part of people having psychotic breaks, they'll believe stuff that's technically impossible. I don't know. I did find it interesting, and especially in the Operation Paperclip, MK Ultra, human experimentation stuff, because it is documented that the U.S. government made deals with a fair amount of Nazi officials to have them be expatriated to America in return for America having access to their research. I believe that happened with Japanese scientists as well, which is an interesting thing to think about in terms of Pynchon's connections to the military-industrial complex and stuff. But
Well, I definitely agree with you as far as that the kind of duality of Dr. Hilarius and whether or not, because it's never explicitly confirmed that he was where he claims to have been and that he did what he claims to have done. So we're kind of taking him at his word if we can. And yeah, he absolutely could just be going through a complete mental breakdown. The first thing that came to my mind reading that section was how it paralleled the scene in Doctor Strangelove with I'm forgetting the name of the characters. Peter Sellers' character and
Mandrake and Ripper.
Thank you, Mandrake and Ripper. It had a lot of parallels to how that scene was set up and it played out, and it makes sense because Strangelove came out at 63, if I'm not mistaken, which would have been around the time that he was writing this. So I obviously Pynchon loves his TV and film references, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was intentionally kind of placed in there to give that kind of dark humor that Dr. Strangelove carried with it.
I feel like Hilarius is afraid of enough completely irrational things that are not based in. Well, okay, let me restart that sentence. I feel like his fear of the Israeli spec ops coming to abduct him is delusional enough that it makes me not want to doubt his Buchenwald story. I mean, obviously, there's no such thing as a face that drives people insane, but he's also, assuming that the one time he did it proves that it's a reliable process, and he mentions other studies that they did that found much less success. And in particular, it seems to me like his response to Oedipa not killing him, his just breaking down into tears, is much more of a sincere expression of regret in some way than an indication of really anything else, I guess.
I think the other thing that lends credence to the idea that he was there, but potentially, through a haze of LSD, doesn't remember what he did or is undergoing some kind of a psychotic break in relation to whether or not he actually did drive people insane, is the fact that he talks many times about how, as a methodology of atonement, he tried to align himself with like Jewish psychoanalytical principles from Freud, as opposed to German, therapists or philosophers. He established his practice in Kinneret, which is a Hebrew word that is used often for the Sea of Galilee that runs through Israel. So there also does seem to be a desire in him to align with things related to Jewish people, as he puts a couple of times, as a way to kind of make up for the things that he did in the past, which doesn't seem like the actions of somebody who is completely hallucinating their experience or just lying.
it is also quite possible that he's feeling so much guilt and he's so haunted by what he's done that has caused him to have a psychotic episode. I do think that's possible as well.
I was about to say the same thing, that the weight, and it would be an enormous weight, especially for someone who recognizes the impact that they had in that kind of a situation, could absolutely lead to that kind of a breakdown. And I think there's some credence to the breakdown in my mind, at least, when he talks about that face, that I can make a face, kind of, that there's such a sense of this wanting to have this power that no one else can have, that I think ties more to the breakdown side of it. But I think to get to that breakdown, absolutely, yeah, it could be just because of everything that he did, and the reality of it all has sunk in. And so he is, LSD is that way of trying to block out or come to terms and make sense of everything that had happened already. And it just was too much, overloaded, and you overload the circuit and it just blows out like that.
Especially to your point with what Mucho says at the end of the chapter about LSD. If it is truly like increasing your sort of emotional or mental capacity, it's possible that through using LSD over and over again as a way to try and either understand it or apply to his own practice and his own mental health, it just made it even more clear how evil what he did was, and it drove him to completely lose his mind.
And so what do you all take from his insistence that he never took LSD and that he did so, he refused to do so for the sake of maintaining his ego distinction, and yet he still, the moments just before that are him expressing that, oh, hey, I just assumed you were some part of just a group of people, the others, another. It seems contradictory. So
Yeah.
It does. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just agreeing.
It could be, because I know I'm trying to remember the history of LSD and its creation and everything. And if I remember correctly, when it was synthesized, it wasn't known at the time that it would do what it would do. It was because it was accidentally, and I don't know that it was accidentally ingested necessarily. I think it was just in the way that it was being handled, it triggered the reaction that it had. And it could be, if that's the case, then it could be the case with Hilarius, that even just in administering it and handing it out, if he's handling it improperly, it could be having an effect on him.
One thing I found interesting is the quote, at least I know who I am and who the others are, which does seem to speak to the fact that he understands the psychedelic headspace, where he's expressing the fact that he has not experienced the psychedelic headspace, but he understands it, because a big part of the psychedelic head state, and this is kind of cliche, but it's also, I think pretty true, is that people, when they're on, mushrooms, LSD, whatever, they tend to do this whole, like, everything is connected. We're all one person, like hippie, like, Mother Earth type stuff. We're all equal and the same and that kind of stuff. So he does have some knowledge on what his patients are going through, and has obviously talked to them about their emotions while they're on the drug.
So the last character we have, honestly, there's really not much to mention about him, I don't think, is Cesar Funch, Mucho's boss manager, who's kind of tacked in there at the end. I don't really have anything to say about him particularly, if anybody else does.
all I can think of is that he makes an interesting contrast point where Mucho does have both Oedipa, at least prior to the end of this chapter, and Funch trying to look out for him, while Oedipa is constantly feeling completely isolated.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to discussing the things that happen in this chapter. So, at the beginning of the chapter, we have that scene where Oedipa's dreaming of making love to Mucho on the beach. Do you think that is a sign of her missing him, or just missing the comfort of familiarity?
I think it's the comfort of familiarity, but I also think that it has to do with what she had hoped that marriage would be, and believing that perhaps she had found someone who really loved her and could be there for her. And now that she's going through this process in the chapter of understanding that that is not what the relationship is, and that she's going to have to walk away from it, she's just sort of dreaming of the reality of what it could have been if it had gone the way that she had hoped.
I think it's important to note that the dream happens in a California that doesn't exist. I did kind of mentally link it with Mexico, and perhaps her trip with Pierce to Mexico, and perhaps some like dream displacement where she's been thinking about Pierce so much that then her mind transfers that to Mucho in like the unconscious, dream way. Yeah,
that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, what it really says to me is, yeah, I agree, Tate, that it indicates, some sense of a dream that has not come together. But what it is also, she's dreaming about Mucho having sex with her in a paradise while she's staring at her own reflection in the mirror. And it seems, with so much narcissism in this, imagery throughout this entire book, I find it very hard to not think of it in some way as both discussing how, she just the straightforward contrast of, she had somebody she thought she could trust and suddenly she's alone, but also the idea that it was all in her head to begin with, that Mucho and she were never destined for true love.
Yeah.
So this is a bit off topic, but there was a few things I liked about the opening that I wanted to point out, or this kind of small stuff. I did see in my guidebook to Crawling of Lot 49, they do explore a little bit of why the opening sentence says should instead of could, which does seem to imply to me that the narrator knows that W.A.S.T.E is dead. It's just that Oedipa doesn't, because if it was should, then if she had gone to W.A.S.T.E right then she might have caught him before he died, which is interesting to think about. I found two different parts of that opening to be reminiscent of Vineland. The description of the hotel, being up in the hills, did remind me of the wedding scene in Vineland, which is a pretty fun scene. And then there's
that's one of my favorite scenes in that book.
Yeah, I like that part a lot. And then there's the phrase "leaf fractured," which I think the opening paragraph, or maybe even the opening sentence of Vineland, describes the sun playing through a tree as it relates to the sun shining on, I think it's Zoid in his house, which I thought was interesting as well.
So the next, there was a part, this might be, I don't know that it would be the most pinch on part of the chapter for me, but we'll get to that when we get to it. But there's a scene when she's walking around let me find the exact page here. She moved through it carrying her fat book, attracted, unsure, a stranger, wanting to feel relevant, but knowing how much of a search among alternate universes it would take. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it goes a lot farther than that, but I found that paragraph to be absolutely enthralling. I went back and reread it a few times just to kind of really take in all of it. It seems to me that it's really just kind of exploring the difference in college culture at that time against the time that Oedipa would have been enrolled, which, if my math is correct, if she's 27, 28, would have been kind of the tail end of the whole McCarthyism and all of that. So the college culture she's seeing now would have been vastly different than the experiences she would have had if she, I don't know that it's ever explicitly stated that she went to college, or if it's even implied.
I think I'm not sure if it is stated. I have seen scholars take it for granted that she went to college. I'm not sure exactly what passage that gives them that impression. But I have seen critics just kind of refer to her as being a college graduate.
It feels implied in the sentence. This Berkeley was like no somnolent Siwash out of her own past at all. It's definitely ambiguous.
Yeah, whether she graduated or not, I mean, it's hard to think that she wouldn't have at least attended college, or if she had friends that were there, would have been there. But yeah, I thought that was interesting to kind of explore that difference in the college culture in that short of a span of time.
Yeah, there's actually a lecture that you can listen to. I forgot the university or the professor's name, unfortunately, but it's uploaded on YouTube of a professor who's teaching the book, and she talks about that particular chapter, I think, or that part of the chapter for about an hour, and exploring the difference between how it would have been, not just in present tense when she was giving the lecture, but also between around the time that Oedipa would have been in college and then when the book was actually happening. It seems as though Pynchon was... It also seems very intentional that he chose Berkeley, too, for everything that's happened at Berkeley, in trying to deliberately showcase it as probably a institution that has grown into something that is very anti-establishment, which likely was not the case in the preceding 2 or 3 decades.
I think I know the video you're talking about. Was that the one from Yale?
That sounds correct.
Yeah. I've watched parts of that. I need to go back and finish it, but I really enjoyed what I saw of it. We also get, and correct me if I'm wrong here, this is the first time entropy is mentioned. The word itself, not necessarily the concept, but the actual word is I believe the first time we get it in this book.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, for anyone who, if this is your first Penchon, get a good understanding of what entropy is, because you're going to see it a lot. So so there was a quote. Let me pull it up here. When she's with Nefastis, and it has to do. Let me pull it up here because I want to get the exact quote. Here we go. The sensitive must receive that staggering set of energies and feed back something like the same quantity of information to keep it all cycling. That, I thought, really kind of spoke to the whole conspiracy theory side of this, in that in order to keep that going, as when we talked about this before, when you get to a certain point in really any conspiracy theory, you pass that point of return, and you at that point, I think, have to start kind of finding symbols and signals where there may not actually be any, and you're kind of creating this self-contained echo chamber. Even it's more, I think nowadays you can get it more as an actual echo chamber with the internet and everything like that, but you have to keep feeding that machine, so to speak, to keep what you're going after moving forward. Otherwise you stall out and you suddenly have no purpose and no way to keep it moving and keep having something to go forward to.
Yeah, I think that this whole scene with Nefastis, I'm going to try and keep my comments here short because I could talk about this scene for a long time, but I think this whole scene with Nefastis and the machine that he's created is really a microcosm of a lot of the things happening in the book as a whole, from a standpoint of talking about extracting meaning, of sorting logic from, illogical conceit, and just the whole way that it's set up to, from the cadence of what happens, is so important, because she's going there after speaking with somebody who has confirmed the existence of W.A.S.T.E as a real entity, and she's going there because she's interested in whether or not she is somebody who is going to be capable of operating as a sensitive, who's going to be able to power the sorting engine of the box, so to speak. And she's brought into that room, she sat down, she's explained what entropy is. The quote in particular where Nefastis says, a metaphor, it connects the world of thermodynamics to the world of information flow. The machine uses both. The demon makes the metaphor not only verbally graceful, but also objectively true, is a pretty bold-faced statement of all of those ideals of sorting out meaning from experience and sorting out fact from fiction. And after she sits there and stares at the photo for a really, really long time, she thinks that she actually makes it work. Like, it mentions that she sees out of the side of her eye that she feels as though not only the picture has changed, but that the piston must have moved slightly. And then it isn't until seemingly television is responsible for breaking her conversation that she fails, and then he comes in and tries to initiate a sexual encounter with her. And so, looking at it as a microcosm of the whole book, it's as if Oedipa does contain the possibility that she is capable of tracking down the truth behind W.A.S.T.E about understanding the Tristero, that she can be a sensitive, she can be a sorter, she can be somebody who makes the laws of thermodynamics and information flow work. But it is ultimately going to be outside forces that disrupt that for her. And then the moment she fails, the moment there is an outside force that disrupts her ability to actually complete that, is when suddenly there is another instance of one of her oppressors coming back in to try and keep her in her place. It's such a perfect scene for so many reasons, but particularly as a sort of gestalt of the book's themes and an explanation from Pynchon to the reader of what's really going on there. I think it's absolutely brilliant.
I agree entirely. But it is interesting because that whole phenomenon of her feeling like she might have just seen it before being distracted by random Hanna-Barbera cartoons, for one, is incredibly is a prevalent theme throughout all of Pynchon's works. That particular coordination of paranoia and distraction, and more generally, that is paranoia. It is that sense that if you just try a little harder, if you just think about it a little more, it'll make sense. And you're right. Look, the piston has to move. You know it has to move. You're just gonna have to sit there and focus long enough until you see it move. And so, while it is on a symbolic level, very much an indication of her being distracted by outside forces in order to prevent her from actually sorting, what it is as well is just a simple explanation of how delusional she's become.
Yeah, great point.
There's two parts of that section that I found really interesting. The first is that sentence: the demon collects data on each and every one. If it was just the demon collects data, period, it would make more. It would have kind of gone over my head a little bit more. I wouldn't have focused on it as much, but it did remind me of the fact that U.S. government surveillance, I think, was pretty widespread in the '60s, and I'm under the impression that wiretaps were not made illegal until like about a year after this book was published, which is interesting. I mean,
That sounds right.
Yeah, because if it was just the demon collects data, you can maybe link that to the government being the demon or something. But the fact that it's on each and every one is interesting to me. That it's kind of speaking to how widespread government surveillance was at that time. And then that same paragraph, the last sentence, one little movement against all that massive complex of information destroyed over and over with each power stroke. That does seem to kind of point to, I link that to kind of the pointlessness of individual protests, and how if just one individual tries to subvert the system or bring down the system, they're just going to be completely overwhelmed, and it's not going to have any effect. And the power of the crowd is much more than the power of the individual.
Yeah, a single voice is just going to get washed out by all the background noise. The other thing this made me think of, and this kind of actually just hit me while we were talking about it, was how, from my admittedly limited knowledge on it, how much this seems like a Scientology rip, where that whole thing of just sitting in a room and trying to make a thing happen that isn't really there. I haven't actually gone through that. I can't remember what they call it. The whole Dianetics, whatever the test is.
Processing.
I think
processing.
It is
Thank you. That's what it is. Yeah. It reminded me of that. Just that kind of. It's just ridiculous by its own nature of just sitting there and trying to make something out of nothing, and then believing that there is something in the nothingness because you've just convinced yourself that there is.
That your mention of Scientology is interesting to me, because looking over, I searched Crying of Lot 49 on the Pynchon subreddit, and I did find somebody who seemed to take it way too much for granted that the Crying of the Lot 49 is a reference to Jack Parsons' book Liber 49. Which Jack Parsons, he was a rocket scientist, which would play into the Gravity's Rainbow, Lot 49 being written around at the same time as Gravity's Rainbow. And there is the reference to magic in this chapter, the high magic of low puns. And I believe that there's not, I think that's the only reference to magic in the whole book. Just for fun, I did read Parsons' Liber 49, which is a pretty short book. I think it would have come out as like a pamphlet or something. I didn't find anything at all, really. I found two different quotes that you could kind of, if you're stretching it a little bit, you could link towards this chapter. The main one is, "Thou shalt be outcast and accursed, a lonely wanderer in abominable places," which I do think you could link to Oedipa's search for meaning in this chapter, but I don't know. The guy on the subreddit, like I said, seemed very sure of himself. And I don't really know a lot about Jack Parsons, but Jack Parsons was like lived with L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard like stole Jack Parsons' wife and also conned Jack Parsons out of a large amount of money. So it just reminded me of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also, I think it was what you said last week, Will, that you thought that Kotex or that someone at Yoyodyne could have been being brought up as Pynchon's hatred of Jack Parsons, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Nefastis doesn't pop up again in the rest of his books, but Jack Parsons is specifically railed against for like a conspicuously long paragraph in kind of somewhere in the middle of part 3 of Gravity's Rainbow. And Jack Parsons was kind of the guy who got rocket science into a real science, because prior to that, it was viewed as just as absurd as Maxwell's demon. The idea that you would somehow be able to force solid fuel to burn in certain directions and have essentially like an inverted chimney that directs all of the oxygenation and provides that thrust. So Parsons is very similar to Nefastis. I mean, outside of rocket science, he is mostly famous for hanging out with L. Ron Hubbard and Aleister Crowley, throwing sex parties, just generally kind of abusing his reputation as a boundaries-pushing genius scientist, despite having very little to actually show for it. And that actually, the moment where he's describing, Nefastis is describing that communication is the key, reminds me a whole lot of the section actually in the first chapter of Against the Day, where they describe how their perpetual motion engine works.
Mm-hmm.
It just, I think Pynchon has some real desire to be able to write those bullshit explanations for non-existent functioning engines in the same way that people in the 1800s did all the time.
So when Oedipa leaves Nefastis's house, and rightly so, she there's a quote in here that I really liked. Amid the exhaust, sweat, glare, and ill humor of a summer evening on an American freeway, Oedipa Maas pondered her Tristero problem. All the silence of San Narciso, the calm surface of the motel pool, the contemplative contours of residential streets like rakings in the sands of a Japanese garden had not allowed her to think as leisurely as this freeway madness. That line resonated with me on a level that I was not ready for. I have these kind of moments of driving and just like in a weird way I can focus more, even though my brain is doing so much more, with paying attention to what's happening all around me. It's a weird time that I can focus and think about weird things if I need to. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but that definitely hit me that way.
No, that's definitely a thing for me, especially with my creative writing endeavors. I can get very frustrated. So I'll be driving and it seems like I'll realize all this stuff that I really should be writing down. And as I've gotten older, I've done a lot better job of not getting on my fucking phone while driving and not being an asshole like that. But I get what you're saying completely, where the mind seems to kind of slip into like a state where you can do like higher level thought very easily while you're driving.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I have a 25-minute commute to work every single day. So I'm spending about an hour on the road every day between going to work and going home, and I do a lot of the same thing. And to your point, Luke, with my own creative writing with the novel that I'm finishing, like a lot of my best thoughts come during that period.
Yeah, I experienced that as well. And in some way, I think of it as a metaphorical constructive interference.
It's an interesting name for it. I like that. So the next little bit that I wanted to mention for my reading through of this was, this is on page 88 from mine. It says, either Tristero did exist in its own right, or it was being presumed, perhaps fantasied by Oedipa, so hung up on and interpenetrated with the dead man's estate. This to me is kind of that that moment where Oedipa's paranoia and everything that's happening really gets cemented. This is to me like her last grasp at getting out of it, the last opportunity she has to escape the net, so to speak, and put all of it behind her and move forward with her life in a more constructive way. But obviously where she goes is the opposite and falls further into it.
Yeah, especially, I mean, coming from the previous quote you read out of driving and just sort of letting her mind kind of wander and relax after her encounter. The other line in that same paragraph where it says she only had to drift tonight at random and watch nothing happen to be convinced it was purely nervous, a little something for her shrink to fix. Like, there is definitely an initial impulse there of I can make this go away if I try. But the world that she's about to drive into makes that impossible for her.
Yeah, it's almost like she's an alcoholic who's like, yeah, I'll just nurse a beer tonight,
Right.
Mhm.
and it just pushes her further down the tunnel.
Well, we kind of already went over the whole scene in the Greek way a little bit when we were talking earlier about the unnamed character there. Did anybody else have anything more that they wanted to add on to that scene?
Well, I'm curious if any of you recognized the cherubic face description of the real Arnold Snarb, and if maybe that was used in another section of the book, and so as a hint to the identity of Arnold Snarb.
I can't
don't-
say
I
I've
didn't
noticed
catch that.
anything. No.
I don't think so, just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I clocked the description, but I can't say that it matches with anything else from the book that I can
Yeah.
remember.
I did want to mention that I really appreciate the use of the real bar, the Finocchios, which is the Italian version of the F slur.
Oh, is it? I
But
didn't. I had
It's
no
a
idea.
real bar in San Francisco. Yeah.
So we talked about the kind of story within the story that the unnamed guy goes into regarding the IBM person who was going to self-immolate like the Buddhist monk, and then the guy that was basically responsible for canning him came in and told him all about how he's doing it wrong. I kind of wanted to go back on that real quick and just use that as an example of Pynchon's humor, because I think a lot of times we mentioned this, I think, in maybe the first episode, there tends to be a lot of, especially in the academic discussions that I've seen, there tends to be a sort of, I don't want to say it gets swept away, but there's not as much mention of his humor. It's more focused on the kind of, highbrow or abstract nature of a lot of what he does. But there's so much twisted and dark and sometimes just juvenile humor that exists in his work. And this is such a good example of that.
Yeah, true. And I think, I mean, we've talked, I think, in every single episode so far about the mix of highbrow and lowbrow humor, which I definitely think comes from how much he loved TV and loved entertainment. And I think it asked a question, Cody, last week about whether or not the mention of television with the conversation with Mr. Thoth was pointing to anything. I think largely it's pointing to the same thing that the scene with Nefastis is pointing to, where while the TV is confusing Thoth's ability to recall his memories or his past conversations, it also disrupts Oedipa's ability to focus. I think there's something very real within Pynchon where he recognizes the fact that television can distract people and can confuse people and can be something that is incredibly damaging in one way or another, but also he seems to recognize that the same types of humor or storytelling or absurd elements of cartoons or lowbrow humor that is most commonly associated with television can be used for like good reason and can add something to for lack of a better term, higher art. And it shows a real media literacy on his part that he's able to blend those things seamlessly.
Yeah, he repeatedly throughout his books, but it's very clear in Lot 49 and I think in Vineland, if I'm remembering correctly, that his issue with television is not what the the moral majority of the time would have been complaining about, or that was later, but the same people 20 years earlier. It's not about like, oh, these are stupid boxes. They don't challenge you, so they make you stupid. What he's concerned about is it's essentially like an inverted information silo where everybody's getting the same information, and so whoever manipulates the degree of truth in the television programming has immense power. And so it's more of a stochastic fear than a condemnation of the juvenile or the simple, because yeah, everyone does like laughing at some dumb jokes every once in a while.
Yeah, I think it would be foolish to say no. Well, I think there are certainly humorless people in the world.
Yeah, quite a few of them.
Sure.
There's that quote attributed to Pynchon's sister where like Pynchon's sister's husband asked her what's Thomas Pynchon most likely doing right now, and she said watching the Brady Bunch. Which is just kind of funny to me to think of Pynchon, perhaps stoned or perhaps sober, just sitting there watching the Brady Bunch. It's so like, it's typical for television of that time, I think, but it even worse for the Brady Bunch. It's so like, suburban and safe, and I don't know. It's just interesting to me.
In the way that Oedipa finds some, as I said, constructive interference on the freeway, I get the sense that Pynchon uses schlocky television as just a sounding board for his own ideas, that he's just sitting there watching, laughing, sincerely appreciating the humor and the humanity that's there, but also the back of his mind, his subconscious maybe, or just, not fully engaged. He is also throwing ideas out at it and trying to fit his own themes into the media in front of him and seeing how they bounce off.
Yeah, I agree completely. That was more or less what I was going to say. And I think we'll have a lot more to talk about it when we get to Vineland, because it's a bit more prevalent there, in my opinion. But it also seems to be something that a lot of other authors have done over their careers too. I mean, not to bring him up again, but David Foster Wallace was a television addict and talked a lot about like seductive commercial entertainment and how it can be. It's about what you take out of it. Both Pynchon or Wallace or any other number of authors clearly had some level of derision for something in it, but they were still able to grasp something from it and utilize that other part of their brain to add it to their own medium as a way to connect with their audience, or to break up the monotony of their text, or just to inject humor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's television, especially in this time period, was and still is a real double-edged sword. You can really, I think it's important for us to be able to kind of shut our brains off in a way and just kind of sit and enjoy something for an hour and a half, 2 hours. But at the same time, like Will said earlier, like whoever's in control of the information that's being broadcast absolutely dictates the message that's getting sent out there. And if you're not able to sort the information properly, to kind of use the Maxwell's demon analogy, then it can have these kind of dangerous consequences. And I think that's kind of what we see, and I think that's kind of what he's getting at with a lot of this is, it really comes down to what you do with the information that you're given and how you process and analyze that information going forward, and then apply it to whatever it is you're examining.
Which seems to be a broader theme of Pynchon's work in general. That was something that he wrote about a lot.
So kind of on that note, when in kind of two different places, there's this kind of discussion almost of what I took as confirmation bias. First, in the story of the guy who was going to self-immolate because of everything that happened, he placed an ad to kind of see what to do. And to me, that kind of felt like, he already has set in his mind what he's going to do. He just kind of wants that positive, not necessarily positive feedback. He wants that affirmation that, that's the choice. That's what you should do. And obviously that backfired because, he got the opposite of what he wanted. But then Oedipa also, when she starts wandering around town. There's the line in here, and she spent the rest of the night finding the image of the Tristero post horn in Chinatown in the dark window of an herbalist. She thought she saw it on a sign among ideographs, but the streetlight was dim. Later, on a sidewalk, she saw two of them in chalk, 20 feet apart. Between them, a complicated array of boxes, some with letters, some with numbers. Oedipa's at this point now where she's so entrenched in this whole thing that she wants to find this, and she's going to see it where she wants to see it, whether it's actually there or not. Her mind is going to interpret these things that may or may not be what it really is. It's going to interpret them as what she wants it to be.
Yeah, and even later on, just a couple of pages later, it specifically says that she can't remember how many times it happened. Literally, she grew so to expect it that perhaps she did not see it quite as often as she later was to remember seeing it. A couple, 3 times would really have made enough, or too much.
Mm-hmm. And also, she's in all of this, she's drunk and kind of sobering up as she's going through, but nonetheless, her perception is already distorted from, being drunk. So,
and sleep deprived.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I kind of forgot about that, like how at this point how little sleep she's getting, which is combined with alcohol, definitely not a good state of mind.
Well, and this whole section, basically from the moment she runs from Nefastis through to when she gets back to Kinneret, I have a very hard time reading this as not intentionally written to make the reader consider that she's been dosed with some kind of psychedelic. Because this chapter, to me and to a lot of other people, feels like the epitome of like a bad acid trip. We're constantly just wandering around, making mountains out of molehills, but ignoring, the curb in front of your foot.
Particularly when she finally gets to the children and they're playing around a muted post horn that's been drawn in chalk. Like that in particular is very bad trip imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, and they even say that they say something to the effect of like they're not really there, they're just dreaming that they're there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what did y'all make of that? Because I find that a really beautiful moment in the book and kind of a weirdly wonderful reprieve from the tension of the rest of this chapter. But it's also just disturbing on some other level.
It is. It's a haunting kind of thing. I mentioned this to y'all off the episode earlier during the week that this whole scene reminded me of David Lynch's Inland Empire, which it's an amazing film, and it kind of there were some parallels that I was thinking of while reading this, and I went back and rewatched the movie a couple days ago, and there's a long part of the movie. The whole kind of premise of the film is that this actress essentially falls into believing that she is her own character and trying to determine what parts of the film are her as the actress and are her as the character is all blended together and distorted. And I kind of got that same vibe when Oedipa was wandering around in this, sort of dreamlike, or I hadn't really made the connection to the LSD thing, but that would make sense as well. But her brain at this point is in a situation where it's just processing so much information and it doesn't know what to do with it, and so it's kind of twisting it into the only thing that she can imagine it to be. And then you have all these moments like when she runs into these kids and they're talking about how we're not really here, we're dreaming ourselves being here. It had such a Lynchian feel to it that I that's where my mind went with it.
Yeah, I think the other part of it that I always come back to that I find particularly sweet is Pynchon seems to be commenting on the innocence of children too, in that these kids are playing around a symbol that, as we've learned, has to do with murder and conflict between the U.S. postal system and whatever organization controls this and is associated with all of these shadowy underground groups, that some of which are just social outcast people, but some of other are most likely very nefarious organizations, the associations of what it is that they're, playing with and jumping around on are not clear to them. And it's just they're making a game out of it. And just that relative innocence of childhood, of just being able to escape the cruel realities of the world that you live in simply because you're not aware of them yet. That's always the portion of this chapter that comes across to me in how Pynchon writes out that section.
Yeah, and then that's not immediately, but shortly thereafter, contrasted a couple of pages later, where Oedipa is realizing the connection between the disenfranchised and the waste system in the post-horn. It says, "A child roaming the night who missed the death before birth has certain outcasts do the dear lulling blankness of the community."
Yeah.
I don't know what that contrast means, but it's right there.
I mean, it could very much just be a yearning for childhood again.
Yeah, because I mean, she's we kind of get the impression that she wants that return to a simpler time. With the dream of Mucho and other instances where we've seen that she's still aware of how her life was and still I think wants to be able to go back to that, but just at this point can't. And yeah, definitely kids have that I don't want to say ignorance of the world around them, but that's kind of what it is. Like they're not exposed to that kind of stuff at such a young age. Most of them, unfortunately, there are kids who have to deal with that kind of shit. But so many kids can just, do what they're doing and they're not worried about all the bullshit that goes on around in the world. And it would be nice to be able to have that mentality as an adult.
Yeah.
Let's kind of go back to the Jesus Arrabal section of this, because I think there's a lot that we can kind of touch on. And I know we kind of talked about it earlier, but I think that's kind of a vital scene. Did anybody have anything in particular with that scene that they wanted to go over? I looked into I'm probably horribly mispronouncing the name, Bakunin, who was a Russian socialist and anarchist. I didn't go too deep into his whole background, but it seemed like there was some interesting connection with his character in there. Have any of y'all had any familiarity with him?
I have seen him mentioned in relation to Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which does get into an exploration of what an anarchist society would actually look like and how it would function in a pretty in-depth way. I think The Dispossessed would have come out. It was the late 60s, early 70s, so it's around this time. But that's the only place I've seen that proper noun ever, is in relation to her research for that book.
Yeah, I've never read any book Bakunin, but I think generally he's viewed as the father of anarcho-syndicalism.
Yeah.
That he's, just kind of the guy who tried to combine Max Stirner's egoism with the Marxist dialectic of history.
So something else, and I don't know if anybody else picked up on this. There's a brief line on my edition. It's on page 100. It's just a sentence, "So it went." And my mind immediately went to Kurt Vonnegut. He famously used the phrase "so it goes" in Slaughterhouse-Five, which came out only a couple years after this was published. I couldn't find anything that explicitly tied his line to this line, but it's similar enough in not only the choice of words. It's only 3 words, but I mean, it's, one word is different in there, but also in just the kind of the meaning of it. But I, for the life of me, could not find anything where, obviously I couldn't find anything where Pynchon was talking about Vonnegut, but I couldn't really find anything where Vonnegut talked about Pynchon and any influence he had. I know they both, to me, from what I have read, I've read a lot of Vonnegut. There is a lot of similarities that could be drawn between his work and Pynchon's. Obviously, Vonnegut leaned way more into the sci-fi end of things and had a very different writing style. But I think thematically, they touched on a lot of the same kind of things, and they shared a lot of the same ideologies and views, especially given that they were both of them went to Cornell. They both were in World War II, and they both had ties into World War II. Vonnegut obviously was way more entrenched into it. But I don't know if any of y'all caught that, or if you have any thoughts on that.
What yeah, so did Slaughterhouse-Five come out after Crying of Lot 49?
69.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just wondering.
I think that there's a lot of comparison between the two of them. Like they do have similar lives to your point, but also on a real broad base, they do talk a lot about the same things thematically. Certainly less so like paranoia or conspiracies or some of the stuff that is very directly related to Lot 49. But I think while Pynchon is certainly bleaker in his outlook on the world, they are similar writers in terms of thematic intent. So I wouldn't be surprised necessarily if Vonnegut had read Lot 49 and pulled some inspiration there, but I can't say that I would know of anything specific.
Yeah, the general attitude of so it goes or so it went. I mean, in Slaughterhouse-Five is often read as an icon of essentially what PTSD does to your brain, and I think it's something that pops up in a lot of people who've been through traumatic events in their lives. But in a lot of ways, Vonnegut, he's like 10, 15 years older than Pynchon.
Yeah, I think he was a little bit older. Yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of like he's slightly less bitter because he didn't realize his genius at such a young age. He feels like he felt he had less of a chip on his shoulder and less of something to prove to the world, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting little bit in there. Let's talk about the dance that happens at the deaf mute gathering. I thought it was a really, really interesting scene in the book. What did y'all take from it?
It does seem to speak to the absurdity of this book in general. I mean, the whole thing of them all dancing and not knocking into each other. It did strike me as somewhat impossible. I played football in high school. I went to a small Christian high school in Colorado Springs, and high school football is just not near as big of a deal in Colorado as it is in places like Texas. I'm not trying to brag or anything, but anyway, we played. We would play each year. We were in the same conference as the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind. So I do have some experience with, something like this where, they couldn't hear the whistle in basketball and football. So there would be miscommunications and, late hits and a lot of collisions that maybe shouldn't have happened. So it did kind of remind me of that. And it did kind of strike me as just inherently impossible. But it's a fun mental image of people like in a silent room, dancing in a very the mental image I had was them dancing very gracefully and looking really good while they did it and stuff. It's a cool mental image, but it does seem to speak to it's not possible in real life, I would argue.
Yeah, that's kind of how I took it as well. There's a sort of beauty in its chaos, and I had the same image that you did, Luke, of it being almost choreographed in its intricacy, almost like it would have to be, just given the nature of all of those people and how they would have to almost. I would imagine they'd have to practice that and really get a sense of the rhythm without being able to hear any kind of music in it. And it was kind of, to me, in that idea of anarchy being, there is chaos inherent in it, and it's also unobtainable. And I thought that was an interesting little placement in there because, given everything that's happened up to this point, and that kind of distillation of this scene where you have all this what could be chaotic, but is actually just this well-oiled machine almost.
Yeah, I think the inclusion of the reference back to what Jesus says at the end of the paragraph, his line about the miracle, is potentially pointing to a circumstance where things have been sorted out properly, even though they shouldn't, in the way that, Nefastis's machine is supposed to do something that is impossible because if sorting properly is breaking one of the laws of thermodynamics. So it's something that should be chaotic but does work, despite the fact that there is very little input going into these people from a standpoint of not being able to see or not being able to hear. They're still able to work in a perfect choreographed sequence. And I think given the fact that Oedipa feels humiliated at the end of it, or I'm trying to remember what the exact wording of it is, but demoralized. Like, she feels demoralized at the end of it. I think going out of the fact that she was not able to sort things out, she was not able to make a finely ordered, setup out of chaos by being a proper sensitive. Seeing an example of that happening just hits her, that she can't even accomplish what these people have, even though she has more physical agency and faculty, and so she has to run away from it. That's what I pull out of that particular inclusion in the narrative.
Yeah.
Well, and she also gets pulled into it against her will, where they kind of grab her and bring her into it. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at her, really zooming out and looking at it as her whole entrance into this entire story, where she was kind of thrust against her will into this explosion of chaos, and everything is working around her, and she's, like you said, just moving along, being strung along almost, out of control, but being controlled.
Yeah, it's almost an encapsulation of both the horror that would be Maxwell's demon if exercised on a human scale, as well as the beauty that it would produce. And that's the sort of, this is one of those things where I feel it's Pynchon kind of both in the same sentence, expressing hope for an anarchist reality despite his pessimism of the actual potential of that, as well as his sympathies but derision of fascism, because without the demon, everything is coordinated, even though Oedipa has no clue what's going on, even though the dancers can't hear one another, can't listen to the music, can't actually coordinate in any way except via vision, but they're still able to go with the flow.
One thing I did find interesting about that whole part as well is I think I'm under the impression that people that are deaf are able to feel stuff like large amounts of bass. So that could be an aspect of them going along to the beat and stuff, because they perhaps, if the bass is up loud enough, they could still feel it in terms of vibrations.
Yeah, it was something I wanted to look into this, because I'm almost sure there has to be, groups of deaf, excuse me, groups of deaf people who can dance and do things like this, and it would have to be obviously through feeling the vibration. I've heard deaf people talk about. Well, I shouldn't say it like that. I've read of deaf people using the vibration to feel music in different ways. And it's fascinating how you can use that and take in a sensory input in a totally different way and still kind of get the same information from it.
The only thing is it's explicitly stated that the room is silent.
Yes, and that's something I do like about the imagery of it, is that silence, and all you would be hearing really is the the shuffling of feet and the switching of fabric up against itself, would be really interesting. But then, yeah, at the same time, what are they dancing to? So to finish up, let's kind of talk about the last. We went over the scene with Oedipa and Hilarius. Unless anybody has anything else they wanted to add on to that, We can talk about the final scene with Oedipa and Mucho. I'm sorry, Edna Mosh and Mucho.
Yeah, we can move on. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I think we've mined that for all it's worth.
Yeah. So that final scene with Oedipa and Mucho, I thought was really interesting, especially that Mucho taking in all that information at once and claiming he can sort out the singular. Was it a bad tuned violin string?
Yeah.
Yep.
The way this chapter dances between the DT metaphor and then later on Mucho talking about reconstructing the entirety of a musician from one mistuned string of a violin, I think is a beautiful juxtaposition.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
One thing because whenever I first reread this section, the ending section of the book, I struggled with a lot of Mucho's dialogue and what exactly he was getting at and how it perhaps related to him having multiple personalities and stuff. I eventually just kind of concluded that it's basically, in some ways at least, just kind of random word salad. I've had friends who were pretty heavily into psychedelics. I have some experience myself with psychedelics, and it can lead people to just kind of jibber jabber on about really dumb shit, in the same way that being drunk people can kind of just go on and on about stuff and it doesn't make any fucking sense. I did kind of I thought that maybe that section of the chapter could be Pynchon basically complaining about how, I'm sure in the circles that he ran in, there's at least some of this in the 1960s of him having to listen to like stoned or tripping people just go on about a bunch of dumb bullshit. Because it does, whatever Mucho's going on about, I had trouble kind of pinning down like what he was getting at and what the point of it was. And I don't, the only thing that I really drew away from it was that maybe Pynchon just was expressing his frustration with, the type of people that he was having to be around in the 60s.
Yeah, I think it is somewhat of a statement on the abuse of psychedelics, because if you know people who reach that state where they're just babbling endlessly or lose the ability to think coherently, it usually comes after prolonged continuous use, which is not what drugs like that should be used for. And it would appear as though Mucho's taking it the same way you would Tylenol or anything else that would be prescribed. So I do think that you're probably correct, Luke, in that there is somewhat of a criticism going on there. The other thing that I generally pull out of it is if you do interpret Oedipa's, for lack of a better term, odyssey through the evening, where she keeps seeing symbols repeated and sees the children and experiences all of this confirmation of her new reality as potentially being induced by psychedelics in some way, then Mucho's statement of because the world is so abundant, no end to it, baby. You're an antenna sending your pattern out across a million lives at night, and they're your lives too. And then even before that, where he says, you take it because it's good, because you hear and see things, even smell them, taste like you never could. Those seem to be statements that support the fact that Oedipa could have been dosed with something, and that's why she has the experience over the course of the evening that she does. So that's the other reason why I would say that that's included there, because I do believe that is what happened to her.
So I'm just gonna say I don't think it's word salad. I mean, it is not meaningful. It has no value. Like the stuff he's saying is essentially nothing. It all boils down to, oh, I thought this thing and that thing was good. And it's like, okay, sure, great. And the only part that I really find getting into the realm of like actual nonsense is talking about the power spectra differentials of people saying the same phrases. And do either of you sound music folks have any clue? Did that parse at all for you?
I would have to probably go back through and read that section again before I would have any specific thoughts on it.
It feels. I mean, he is getting at something, not something particularly useful to state, but he is getting at something with regard to, whenever anybody repeats the same words, they are acting the same way. They are pretending to be the same person, and he views it as a sincere sort of transcendence and people existing across time and space. But it is also, on a metaphorical level, quite apt to, with regard to things like the secret conductor.
Yeah, see, I took the whole bit of Mucho hearing the music and basically pointing out that one flaw that he could hear. I thought that was interesting in that he's able, under the influence of LSD, to take in these multiple signals at once and process out a singular thought or idea or realization. Whereas Oedipa is almost doing the opposite. She's taking in a singular sign, in this case the post horn, and extrapolating it out into almost an infinitesimal series of ideas and interrelated symbols and ideas and thoughts. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, and I could be way off base there, but that's kind of how I saw that little particular dialogue between them.
It's a good observation.
Yeah.
I also want to mention, going back to the Hilarius using LSD, that was something that I thought was interesting, especially now, 60 years later, that he was, in essence, using LSD to treat his patients. And we are now sort of in a position where LSD and other psychedelics are being used to treat PTSD and a few other mental illnesses, and it's showing actual success. Now, granted, there's obviously a lot of research that would have to be done on it, and it's, from my understanding, outrageously expensive, and so it's almost entirely limited to specific individuals who are, I guess, have enough of an influence or have enough insurance coverage probably to be able to do it. But those who have been able to do it have had almost nothing but good things to say about it.
Yeah, and the fundamental difference between that early attempts to use psychedelics in psychiatry and the current wave is essentially that they were trying to see how they could extend that sense of wonder and that profundity into everyday life, because that's what everyone wants. Ideally, you could feel that kind of joy and terror on a moment-to-moment basis. Just hopefully you have a stronger sense of what's real. And that method of just giving, somebody 100 micrograms a day doesn't work. But the new methods are much more of a matter of taking it and then just doing therapy with a counselor for hours. And so it's a very different approach to using the same tool.
Does anybody have anything else that they want to go over before we get into quotes?
Not personally.
Luke, well?
I wanted to ask how everyone feels about the sailor. The old man with the post-horn tattoo.
God, okay. I don't know how we forgot about that. Yeah. I found that to be a really interesting part of this chapter. And it kind of goes back to the guy in the bar as to whether or not, he's actually connected to this thing or not. Obviously, he seems to have knowledge of it, and what he says to her seems to have some validity, but at the same time, those guys come and talk to him. And I kind of went back and forth on that whole thing, where are his quote unquote friends that come over to help him, is that kind of the government stepping in to kind of, shut this guy up? He's talking too much about what we don't want him talking about, kind of thing. I definitely thought that was a very interesting section of the chapter.
The DT metaphor that immediately follows that, when I first read this chapter, a while ago, I just took it for granted that it made sense. But this time through, it feels almost more word salad than what Mucho's talking about.
It is definitely an instance where the construction of those paragraphs and how she seems to be having a hallucination of the sailor's death, and then going back to reality of what is actually going on, and then back to his death again, is very reminiscent of again that bad trip imagery that she's having that whole evening.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just the fluctuating imagery, like seeing the waist. What is it like? Is it that waist is written on it, or it's the post horn is drawn on it? But then later, when he says just mail the letter, the stamp's on it, and she looks at it again, and it's just a regular stamp. Yeah, I don't know. That was a really interesting scene, and I'm surprised we forgot about that. So I'll use that as a jumping off point to go into quotes, because that scene had my choice for a memorable quote for this book, and it's a long one, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But it starts with the eyes closed, cammed each night out of that safe furrow. The bulk of the city's waking each sunrise, set again virtuously to plowing. What rich soils had he turned? What concentric planets uncovered? It goes on for a while, but it's simultaneously it's for me the most pinch on part of the chapter, and it's also my favorite quote in here. It's so just packed with words. My brain's shutting down already just even thinking about trying to process it. I think I read it like 3 times when I was going back to this chapter, and it was just there's so much going on, and it's so well written to me, that it's one of those instances. And I think I recall the first time I read it, that was one of those parts of it that really made me kind of like stop for a second and just kind of let everything absorb and go back and reread it again. That whole part, I think it's like a 2-page quote that I had marked altogether, is just so well done. That's me though. I don't know. What are y'all's quotes?
It's a great quote, and I think it gets, again, bringing up the fact that she's probably on something during that scene. It gets back to what Mucho says about how each of us are an antenna, and like the moment she touches this man and tries to help him get back into his house, like she starts to not only see his death eventually, but also ponder like what circumstances of creation brought him forth, what things he did, what fields he had plowed, I believe, is one of the questions in there. Just taking on this entire man's life experience in just sort of one brief instant. It's a beautiful section of the chapter, and it both supports the plot in what's going on, but it also just showcases how brilliant of a writer Thomas Pynchon is. My quote is similar in that regard, and it comes from a bit earlier when she first runs away from Nefarious' house, and similarly it's a long quote, so I won't read the entirety of it, but the quote that's on page 95 in my edition says, "At some indefinite passage in night's sonorous score, it also came to her that she would be safe, that something, perhaps only her linearly fading drunkenness, would protect her. The city was hers, as, made up in sleep, so with customary words and images, cosmopolitan, culture, cable cars, it had not been before. She had safe passage tonight to its far blood's branchings, be they capillaries too small for more than peering into, or vessels mashed together in shameless municipal hickeys, out on the skin for nothing but tourists to see." And then it continues on past there, but it's another instance of his remarkable ability to describe settings and place, similar to when she looks at the neighborhood at the end of chapter 1 and compares it to a circuit board. Just his description of streets and byways and alleyways as capillaries and blood vessels running through a body is so genius, and the imagery is so poetic that it's one of my favorite quotes in the whole book.
Yeah, passages like that are there. I don't remember who it was that said it, but someone had mentioned that he writes his sentences like math equations. Everything has a place, and it's very specifically detailed out and balanced. And it's parts of the book like this that really make that ring true. There's just such a beauty to it, but it's so perfectly constructed that it is mathematical in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that quality of his writing is what has caused his work to be so carefully considered for so long. Because if you were, perhaps this is a reductionary phrase, but less capable of a writer, but still operating in the same thematic circles that Pynchon does over the course of his career, I don't think people would have taken notice of him, and I don't think that his books would have been taught or analyzed or discussed even still to the modern day. Like, you can't deny his talent, even if you aren't, like, apparently the Pulitzer Committee aren't able to read his work. You still have to admit that he's an incredibly talented sentence crafter.
Yeah, it demands appreciation whether or not you actually like it.
Yeah.
It would just be completely laughable if he tried to tackle these themes and these plots without his ability to actually dissect these narratives into words.
Mm-hmm.
Will, Luke, do y'all have a quote that you want to talk?
Yeah, I have it's the it's the same one I literally just mentioned about the DTs, and it's it's just huge. It's just, for me, that paragraph is this book. That forcing of the metaphor and the self-aware, the lampshading of this metaphor doesn't make sense, and specifically, sorry, I paged away for a second. Trembling, unfurrowed, she slipped sideways, screeching back across grooves for years, to hear again the earnest high voice of her second or third collegiate love, ray glozing, bitching among uhs, and the syncopated tonguing of a cavity about his freshman calculus DT. God help this old tattooed man meant also a time differential, a vanishingly small instant in which change had to be confronted for at last what it was, where it could no longer disguise itself as something innocuous like an average rate. Where velocity dwelled in the projectile, though the projectile be frozen in mid-flight, where death dwelled in the cell, though the cell be looked in on at its most quick.
Yeah, I love it. Luke, did you have?
Yeah, the quote that I really liked is on, for me, page 121. It starts with it's the paragraph that starts with, under the freeway, he waved her on in the direction she'd been going. Always one, you'll see it. Although Pynchon does seem to focus more on he focuses more on like the experiences of an inanimate object, but then later goes on to talk about the bum, the hobo who occupies that bed in the room. But that whole thing just struck me as very similar to Kerouac. And Kerouac himself would probably have done a similar type of paragraph, just more focused on what the bum has experienced, what the hobo has experienced. Something that came up in some of the scholarly stuff that I read was how similar Pynchon is to the Beat Generation in terms of his focus on the people that are not part of mainstream society, that have either dropped out of mainstream society or were never a part of mainstream society. And that whole quote just struck me as something that could have been in On the Road, except, I mean, it's a little bit more flowery and complicated than the way that Kerouac wrote. That whole paragraph is just really beautiful writing. I did see one of the scholars claim that all artists are nostalgic for the decade in which they grew up. And, the 1930s, when Pynchon would have been growing up, it's kind of one of the cliche things that people think about with the 1930s is, bums and hobos getting on trains and going around America and bumming around. So,
Yeah.
It also occurs to me that Will's quote confirms that Oedipa went to college, because it says that it was her second or third collegiate love.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right.
There you go. Yeah. Good catch. Did anybody have a most Pynchon part of the chapter? I think for me, like I said, it was that quote that Will and I had not Will and I, I'm sorry, Luke and I both pointed out. Did anybody else have anything?
It's hard to pick just one because honestly, like this whole chapter can be
It's riddled with them, right?
summarized as the most Pynchon aspect of the novel, from the mixing of theoretical physics with engineering to the whole extended paranoia trip over the course of the night to the stuff with Dr. Hilarius and its somewhat tenuous relationship to potentially something like MK Ultra to just LSD and subvert. Like there's just so much of it. It's hard to pick one.
Yeah.
I'm partial, I guess, if I have to pick one, to the dance scene. That seems a little bit less characteristic than a lot of the sections we've been choosing so far, but I have a very hard time imagining any writer writing that scene in the same kind of sense that he does.
Yeah, it would definitely not come off the same, I think, in almost anyone else's hands.
Yeah, to kind of build on that, I think I already talked about how the description of the hotel is similar to the wedding scene in Vineland. Just the phrase, a sprawling, many-leveled German Baroque hotel carpeted in deep green, just seems like a very Pynchon way to describe stuff. That whole opening sequence seems like a very Pynchon way to open a chapter.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, if no one else has anything else, that will wrap up chapter 5 for us, and we will move on to chapter 6, the last chapter, and then we'll do a wrap-up episode after that to kind of go over the book as a whole. But I do want to thank everyone who has been listening for staying with us and for going on this trip with us. And we appreciate any questions or comments that anyone has. Please send them over to us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. And we will be back next week to finish this book up. We'll see y'all then.
Bye.
Bye.
See y'all.